Welcome, and thank you for joining the API 201 webinar today as we discuss and look at a closer look at maximizing APIs for secure information exchange. First, a few logistical reminders. This is a live session and it's being recorded. Anyone who registered for this event will receive a link to the recording within 24 hours. And while the lines are muted today, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer your questions during the session. If we can't, we'll get back with you at a later time. In case you missed API 101, as you probably noticed, this is called API 201. If you missed API 101, you can still watch that webinar that occurred back in 2022 simply by going to this QR code and watching it on our website. So if you want to snap that and check it later, that would be great. But we'll be building on those concepts today. So certainly we can talk to some of the things that you would have seen there. But my name is Dan Rice. I'm product marketing manager here at Rhapsody, and I'm really fortunate to have with me today two of our interoperability experts in integration and APIs. And I'm going to hand it over to them for them to both give an introduction. Caitlin?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Caitlin Formal. I'm a solution consultant here at Rhapsody. I've worked in the interoperability space for about the last decade in various roles, from customer support to implementation to solution architecting, and now on the sales engineering side. So kind of looking forward to sharing some of my experiences with you in different use cases. And hand it over to my colleague Dan.
Hey everyone, Dan Sabo. I've been working with the CorePoint engine for about 19 years, most of that time in the professional services department. So my day-to-day is maybe a lot like yours, so building interfaces and solving the problems for our organizations. Looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you guys both for being here. For the agenda today, just to kind of break it down, what we're going to do first is we're going to look at some market trends and what the industry experts are saying as to the value of APIs and perceived value by those folks. And then we're going to also look at integration and APIs today in a more practical way. And hence Dan and Caitlin being on the phone today, we're going to look at some real world examples. We're going to walk through them. We're going to talk about how APIs are used in those examples, which will give us some opportunity to dive into some details, talk about some of the nuances. And then finally, we'll make some observations and takeaways. Really, it's the hardest part about putting this together today has been how to capture the right things in the 45 minutes we have. And so it's really important as we walk through these things to make the most from you. Just give us some feedback, leave it in the chat if there's things you want to talk about more. If it seems like the right time, drop it in the chat, or schedule appointments with us afterwards, because we love to dig into that and build that into future contents, future webinars, possibly an API 301 webinar. Well, so kind of moving on, so why APIs, where's the value? There's an interesting article that was posted back in 2022 that's still on nih.gov, talks about why APIs, anticipated value, barriers, and opportunities. And it really, what's interesting is they use 12 subject matter experts in different roles across the healthcare industry and captured their thoughts around these topics in the article. So I highly encourage you to look at it. But if we were to summarize it briefly, when we look at this diagram to the right, these were the 6 use case categories. They're all intertwined, certainly, but when they talked about patients, they talked about the ease of patients to access and share and aggregate information. Certainly we can do that, connecting our smartphones to EHRs today and gathering and sending information. The administrative side, whether it be prior authorizations or eligibility expediency. When it came to clinicians, they're now much more easily than a decade ago even, of extending beyond the EHR to getting to other innovative products that our HCIT partners are doing and making use of those and capitalize on the value that those products can provide. And really the list goes on when it talks about value-based care, of course, providing better data availability for better outcomes, public health for immunization data. We'll have an example about that in a moment. And then even social services, helping providers have quick access to social risk assessments and also availability and tracking referrals and things that are there when it comes to working with social services. And in essence, what it means is total better experiences for all involved. And we have a blog about that you can see on our Rhapsody page. More data readily available, more efficiencies, whether it just be moving things moving faster or reducing the amount of labor involved, better collaboration between teams, and just easier to navigate and leverage innovations. A couple of different sources that we have here really just speak to the drivers for API adoption. One is an article from AMA Digital Health Research on the right-hand side. It really just surveyed clinicians over the last several years and how they've adopted digital health apps. And if you can see from the graph, the green being the adoption rate since 2022, you can see it's exponential in certain areas like telehealth, but in other areas even, the growth is substantial, and it really speaks to this would not have been possible and would not have been as easy without APIs. Gartner also speaks kind of correlates to this, and to the right here we read Gartner report predicts by 2026, 20% of healthcare providers will have shifted away from patient portals tethered to the EHR in favor of digital front door solutions for their primary method of digital patient engagement. So again, back to what we saw in the previous the article that we referenced here as well, with Gartner saying more and more are getting away from the EHR. They're leveraging these HCIT built innovations, and they're using APIs to do that. So enough of that. Let's talk a little bit about who's on the phone with us, or who's on the call with us today, in regards to what specific areas related to APIs are top of mind for you. And we'd love for you to join. This is an add-in to PowerPoint here today, but it's called Slido. You can capture it on the 2D barcode above. You can also go to slido.com and answer this live survey, because we certainly want to know what specific areas to APIs you're most interested in. And if you if these four things don't meet what's top of mind for you, I encourage you to enter it in the GoToWebinar chat. So supporting new complex workflows, maximizing data access, reducing interface overhead, or securing external endpoints. What's most important to you? And again, if it's something else, please leave it in the chat and we'll see that pop in the chat, and hopefully we can address that. So we definitely have so far an overwhelming supporting new complex workflows, and that's certainly convenient, because I think we'll definitely touch on that today with what Caitlin and Dan are going to talk about. Yeah, thank you so much for your feedback on that. All right, so I'm gonna hand it over. I believe it's to Caitlin first.
Yeah, no, and I like the feedback of, we want to use APIs to support complex workflows, because that's kind of how, when we were preparing content for this webinar, we kind of thought about what do we want to present. And I think the easiest way to do that is kind of, through kind of the evolution of how we use APIs in healthcare. And, let's start at the beginning and kind of go through all those different complex workflows that we can support through our interoperability suite. And a lot of this is using our integration engines. So when we first think about, how we integrate healthcare data, I think when I started in the space back in 2012, a lot of it was very transactional. It was just, I need my demographics that are in one system, I need to send them to another system. And we did that through an Angel 7 ADT interface. But use the interface to use an integration engine to do different mappings. The data had to live in both systems, but I was sending it from point A to point B, just in a transactional model. As we evolved, we were able to send that same type of ADT data, but maybe using like different protocols. And so I think the first time I encountered this using APIs was actually submitting data for public health to an HL7 VXC message to a vaccine registry. So it's still the same HL7 message, the same paradigm of I'm getting data in and I need to submit it somewhere else, but I'm just going to wrap that in a different protocol. I might use my engine to wrap that in a SOAP envelope, or post it using a REST API to submit that to the state vaccine registry. I still use my engine to do any manipulations, but I'm still submitting an HL7 message. just kind of finagling it to make sure that it can fit the specifications for both SOAP or REST APIs. But as we evolved, we kind of found that, you know, I can also use APIs along that route. So not just within, not just to be on my inputs or my outputs, I can also use APIs in the middle to kind of do different message enrichment. So Dan's going to talk about a few of these use cases that, you know, we've encountered. So not just, hey, what's my input, what's my output? What can I actually do to enhance my message as it's traversing through the engine?
Thank you. Yeah. So this is revisiting that initial diagram, the transactional ADT interface that Caitlin introduced. We still have those components, right? Our ADT and our ADT out. Those are in and out. Those are our source and destination still. However, enriching this message, as Caitlin just mentioned, the existing interface we're showing here, you know, many times for those not in the U.S., we have a NPI, National Provider Identifier. So it's an identifier that the physicians have to register for, and sometimes one system will use an internal provider ID, and another one will require this special NPI identifier for a provider. So this interface is showing, you know, maybe this is an internal table within your engine, a code set, a correlation, a lookup table. Maybe it's a database that's external to the engine, a file. Some way this interface, we're diving into the mapping that is happening in the blue box, and we see that one of the things we're doing is getting a lookup, doing a lookup for this NPI and populating it in the message before we send it outbound. So this potentially works for a lot of people with no problems, but if you imagine new providers coming on, maybe higher volume, someone may need to be maintaining this table regardless of where it's being stored. And that's where an interface like this can sort of fall a little short. We can think of that table that was just there as our source of truth, our local source of truth. It turns out, go ahead, Dan. It turns out that there is the real source of truth, the NPPES registry, is the place that providers actually register for their NPI. So this is the real source of truth. And daily, every new provider that registers is updated there on their API. So an advantage we have here is that where before we might find some providers that were not in our local lookup, we should not encounter that if we start using an API to call to this registry. Here in the blue box, we're still showing our general mapping, you know, our logic from top to bottom shows some ADT mapping. The green line being our API query for the NPI, and the arrow is double pointers so that we're sending a response, sending a request, getting a response, and populating that NPI again in our outbound message. Now, so this is great in that we are accessing the one source of truth in real time as we need it. Something that we need to consider though is that if this is a high volume interface, there might be latency involved in this API call that was more than hitting our local lookup. So that's one factor. Another one would be they may, I don't know, they have a very simple website. If you just Google this, you'll find this registry. They don't talk about rate limiting, but that is something that they can do. They can only allow a certain number of lookups in a given time. So if you were to run into that, this may not be a good solution for your environment. So go ahead and advance, Dan. This is the last kind of progression here. We still have that API query in there, but now we're kind of using the best of both worlds. We have our local table lookup, and if it's not present, we go out to the registry, do the lookup, and update our table, and off we go. So just I like this as an example. If you haven't worked with APIs, the website that they have is really simple. It explains how to do very simply how to do the API call. They have a little interactive demo, and there is no security. So there's no authentication required. It's a free API, and there's no authentication. So it's really an easy beginnings to your API exploration if you'd like to dive into that. Go ahead, Dan. So this is a very similar diagram. Very little has changed, but we wanted to talk about semantics. So where we talked about this NPI registry being our one source of truth for the provider NPI, a semantic layer or semantic capability in your environment has to do with terminology, codes. It's your one source of truth for mapping from one code set to another or normalizing your code descriptions. There's a lot of information that that we don't want to have scattered in lots of places throughout our engine. Sometimes it typically is, and a semantic component as our one source of truth for codes and code sets is very analogous to what we were just looking at. So the diagram is very simple. We're still doing message enrichment. You know, as this in this case, we're seeing a lab order come from the EHR and being sent outbound to the lab. Still HL7 in, HL7 out, but we're doing this request along the way to normalize something about a code or map a code from one code set to another. Something else that a semantic tool can do is categorize or have metadata about particular codes. So if the procedure being ordered here was in some way sensitive or there's a privacy concern, that could be found out during this query, and accordingly the logic that came after that was handling that response could make the appropriate changes to the HL7 message before sending it outbound to the lab. So even though it was very similar, we wanted to mention semantic because it's, again, our one source of truth, and we're accessing it when we need it in our runtime logic. Go ahead, Dan.
Absolutely, and just as a side note, for those of you who aren't familiar with semantic, it is part of our Rhapsody interoperability suite. Caitlin was going to talk a little bit about EMPI here.
Yeah, so master patient index is another API that you might be able to call throughout your different workflows that may require, and it's also part of our interoperability suite. So EMPI or master patient index, for those who aren't familiar, it's kind of like your source of truth that allows you to aggregate and understand which patients are who they say they are. So sometimes I might be Katie, sometimes I might be Caitlin, might use my married name. And so what's my identifier for who that Katie, Caitlin, whatever last name I'm using is. So we can call that to get the enterprise unique identifier. So we can do that in a few different ways. I think as we talk about this journey, I think Dan talked a lot about, hey, we can enrich messages. So we can do that. In addition to enriching the messages, we can also interact and update external systems using APIs. And so in this specific use case, we have different patient demographic data coming in from disparate systems. And I need to check this master patient index to say, hey, does this patient exist? If they are, then I'd like to update my message with that respective enterprise unique identifier. So populate that in the ADT so I can submit that to the respective ancillary systems. But in the case that patient doesn't exist, I would actually like to interact with the API, call a different API call that says, I actually want to create this patient within this external system and create the EUID, get that back, and then populate that in my HL7 ADT message. So there's a few different things that, when we think about APIs, it's not just message enrichment as messages are going through the engine, it's also we can manipulate external systems, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in some future examples. The other side of this is that we can also not just can we call external APIs, we can also build upon this as like we can actually be, can receive data from external REST sources. So in this particular use case, when we're talking about the API, is I'm I'm subscribing to different notifications. So if maybe someone merges local identifiers, or if some patient demographics updated, maybe I moved, I want to make sure that my ancillary systems are updated with the most up-to-date information. So it kind of goes back to that source of truth that Dan was talking about in the previous example. But my ancillary systems can only accept ADT or HL7 data. So I need to receive that message over a REST API. It's going to be a JSON payload, which we haven't really talked about too much about payloads. And then map that into the respective ADT event, whether that be an ADT 808, a patient update, or maybe an 840, patient merge, and send that to my ancillary systems. So I can be on that receiving end of that REST API call. When we're thinking about actually hosting an endpoint within our interface engines, there's a few things that we want to consider. In this case, in this specific use case, the inbound, this is all behind the four walls of the hospital. And I only know one, the MPI is the only subscriber that's actually going to be sending to that REST API. But there might be use cases where I have multiple inbound systems, and I need to make sure that, who is calling this API, and we might want to secure that a little bit further. So security is a big thing when we're thinking about APIs. Go to the next slide, Dan. So a lot of times when we have multiple external sources, especially when we're exposing endpoints to the public internet, a lot of times we want to put an API gateway in between. So I like to, simplest example is people using wearables or just sources where you don't want to be maintaining certificates and tokens and stuff within the engine. We typically put an API gateway in between there. When we're thinking about authentication and authorization, there are a lot of things that we need to consider. We want repeatable, audible, and defendable ways of saying, hey, everyone that's accessing this type of data is who they say they are, and they are only accessing the pieces of data that they should be accessing. And so we can put in those different parameters using API gateway, especially if you have multiple sources that are going to be querying for that data. If you think about authentication, authorization, like you probably do this every day. It's you have two-factor authentication. It's you log in, but then they might give you a text back that says, hey, who are you? Okay, you are who I say you are, but when I log in, actually log into my patient chart, I'm Caitlin. My user ID doesn't have access to Dan's data. So we want to be very particular about that, and the API gateway can help us with that. Dan, do you want any color there, both for the input and the output?
Yeah, I actually was a thought about on this input side shown here in the diagram, in addition to security methods that perhaps are either, challenging or not even possible with the current engines that we have, that's where we think of the gateway coming in and being able to serve those needs. I was thinking of another one that's security related, but not necessarily authentication related, and that is what we talked about before, rate limiting. So that's something that a gateway can typically do for you, and if you imagine how you would implement that in an engine, it's possible. But as I imagine it, it seems like a lot of overhead, a lot of building, and a pretty fragile sort of build. So that's something we would like to see handled by an external entity like this, like an API gateway that's specializing in doing this. We also have seen use cases where not only, as shown in this diagram, are we trying to protect our listening web services endpoint that's in the engine, but even on the right-hand side of this diagram, where we would be calling to a REST API, as we've shown in several other cases, there are sometimes security methods being used or customized things that are just much simpler to do outside of the engine. The gateways are being built to handle these sorts of things. So even though we didn't represent it in this diagram, imagine even using a gateway as kind of the last step out the door as we make that call to the REST API on the right-hand side. So there are actually several places where this API gateway idea can fit into an environment. Go ahead, Dan. And I'll pick this one up. This one Caitlin talked about manipulating that EMPI. So not only just gathering data from an API, but actually in her case it was creating a patient, and those are just examples, right? Merging patients. There's all kinds of other things we could be doing. We just didn't show with that EMPI API. This is a case that a customer I work with, they had a partner EHR sending ADTs in, and they needed to keep their EHR up to date. And typically we would see this go as an ADT outbound. In this case, they had done some analysis and determined that the cost they would need to buy from the EHR, their EHR, they would need to buy the ADT interface. They knew that those interfaces were developed quite some time ago, and that there would be a lot of professional services involved in setting it up initially, and potentially some maintenance issues kind of down the road. So they took the approach that to actually do all the things that an ADT interface would do, that vendor's interface would do on the EHR side, they just went with the API access that allowed manipulating this EHR directly and in very granular ways. So this logic is just showing individual API calls for querying for the patient, insurance, creating patient, creating insurance, updating. So just examples, you can imagine, all the things that the API might offer regarding all of the things that can be touched in their EHR, very powerful. So their primary goal was to avoid the costs and the maintenance. They wanted the extra control. You can imagine also that this gives them opportunities for notifying themselves, making certain decisions in certain cases, right? They have complete control, and they can be informed via email or other notifications at any point in their business logic as they do this. That's a big selling point, I think, for this particular customer, rather than just throwing the ADT over the wall and trying to work with whatever that system can do in terms of notification. So this was an interesting use case that I'm wondering if we're going to see more. We saw in our last session, someone talked about vendors are offering less and less HL7 customizations or access. So this is kind of an example of where it wasn't less access, but it was definitely older technology, not up to date. Go ahead, Dan. So we wanted to show it in all of our examples so far. We've seen that the trigger for us making an API call has been some kind of inbound message, usually HL7. Sometimes it was an event coming from an HL7 a REST caller. In this case, we wanted to show polling. So this one is on a timer, and we're showing that upon some interval, we are reaching out to this Fire server on the left, making a call to query for appointments since the last time we checked. And then we loop over those and build an SIU and send. So the result still is an HL7 outbound. That EHR on the right that's what it requires. But rather than, if you imagine the old paradigm, we would just have to have a TCP/IP inbound, and we would make sure that every SIU that comes inbound is being sent, because that's all we get is transactional snapshots, and the EHR on the right is recording them all. In this case, not only do we get to choose our timing, do we get to choose whether we're doing this in a batch at one time of the day, or we're kind of going more real time, we get to choose options in this query that allow us to select only certain appointments. Maybe ER appointments are all that we need to send to this system. So you can, the power that comes to being able to, here again, we have a source of truth, which is this external system with the appointments in it. We're trying to keep this system on the right up to date with those appointments. So we've got our source of truth on the left, and we are reaching out to that system not only when we want to, but exactly how we want to. We don't need to get every single appointment, perhaps. And so there's a lot of power you can see here in using the API method. Dan. This one we left somewhat general. You guys are probably familiar. You've heard about S3 buckets or blob storage, Azure. So Google and Azure and AWS, they all have some kind of cloud storage, and they're all accessed via API. So, you know, in most of our examples, we are looking at calling an API that hits the external system, right? Or we are listening on an endpoint, and the external, our trading partner, is hitting our API in order to exchange data. In this case, there's kind of like an in-between, right? There's an API that both we would access and whoever we are trading data with would access. So it kind of fits into some workflows that we would imagine file drops or SFTP servers would normally be used. Here we're able to use modern security and API methodology to do the polling when we need to. You know, again, we get to check the storage whenever we need to. With things like tags, labels, metadata, we can also be a lot more clever than we could be with SFTP. We can grab only objects that have a certain tag, and then we can update those tags, right? So though just knowing that much about it, if you haven't investigated, hopefully it feels like it opens up a lot of possibilities. You and your trading partner are just simply hitting the same storage containers and same objects, and you're able to interact in this very API friendly way and get your polling exactly when you need it and so forth. Similarly, on the outbound side, we would be able to process messages and then send them to the storage for another trading partner to pick them up. And we've got things like queues and tables and something called a topic, right? With all these different systems out there. Lot to learn in this area, but we wanted to kind of put this out there so you were aware this is the way sometimes we're interacting with trading partners now. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, Dan, I like you highlighted, you know, that example in particular, because I think with APIs, we just have so much more flexibility with the systems that we interact with, you know, especially when we think about how we've evolved from the HL7 paradigm. The HL7 transactional paradigm required, you know, a VPN tunnel on both sides to get it running. And so things that we can, where that can be optimized is, you know, with APIs is, you know, we can do different certificate and token-based exchanges for that authentication piece, which I think can still have its nuances when you're configuring that when during implementation, but it's more maintainable, in my opinion, and allows us to have a lot more flexibility into different security methodologies when we're securing those API interfaces. I think you introduced latency before. Like we're talking about, you know, different nuances that we talk about is anytime you're calling an external system versus calling, you know, an internal lookup table or, you know, a database that's within your four walls. There's going to be some latency that we need to think about. It really depends on how we interact with that system. But luckily, I think within both engines and within even your calling APIs from different custom strips, we can kind of optimize how we're doing those interactions. Did you want to touch on maybe custom headers or anything to add there?
Yeah. I was the thing that the nuances topic brings up for me is that when we're scoping or looking at a new API that we haven't used before, maybe it's custom even. A lot of times it's easy to just focus on what's the format. Okay, it's JSON. What's the structure? How are we going to map from our source message into what needs to go to the API? How are we going to map things back? And there's usually a large document that's given to us that shows what those formats are, what each API call, what format it's going to return, which ones are we going to need to use for our workflow, and then so we may scope our effort based on the complexity of those things. Sometimes we forget that authentication method can take time to nail down. There are sometimes things that aren't necessarily advertised completely on the vendor's API site that take a little trial and error. And custom headers is one that we've seen, you know, we have to actually get in to do some troubleshooting with them only to discover that there was a header that they assumed everyone would always send, and we weren't. So it took a while to nail that down. So some of the nuances around authentication, security methods, keep those in mind as you're scoping your projects.
As we start to wind down, I think, you know, when we looked at all the workflows that Dan and Caitlin went through, it's difficult to boil it down to a few takeaways, but after discussion, after we went through and had prepared these slides, if we had to choose a 3 as a good summarization on how APIs could help us, I think this covers it pretty well. But APIs can help us access as the source of truth that we talked about on multiple occasions today at the right time and in real time. And that's a big difference from the legacy approaches. For example, we saw that with semantic, we saw that with EMPI as the single source of truth. And APIs can also enable new workflows that it could not have been done before, or at least very easily. On-demand calls that were ready to enrich and improve workflows, and data that's needed to complete a process can be gathered quickly and it can be used efficiently versus letting the lack of information create a bottleneck or a manual process. And finally, APIs can help us tackle a diverse set of integration challenges. And APIs coupled with a Rhapsody integration engine create an extra powerful combination with the ability to modify message transformation coupled with APIs really gives you a leg up. And the interoperability suite that we briefly mentioned before not only uses APIs in a number of different ways with all these takeaways, but also helps ensure security of external API endpoints with our API gateway. And through our integrate, identity, and semantic offerings, the Interop suite can help you connect, classify, and clean your data to drive positive outcomes. Any thoughts, Caitlin or Dan, in regards to this?
I like this slide because it kind of illustrates that, you know, throughout our interoperability suite, we can interact with any system or service over a number of different protocols. And some of those might be APIs, but we can also be a hybrid between, you might have still some external systems that might use HL7 or file types, but also we have the capabilities with APIs. And then along that integration process, or you know, as messages are traversing through the interoperability suite, we can make sure that we cleanse and make sure that we have the right patient, and make sure that all your code sets are normalized using both our EMPI and our semantic solutions. So it's a good visual of everything that we can do. I think a lot of people on this call have used our products and they understand how flexible that they are, but we just, you know, hopefully this maybe gives you some ideas for some different workflows that maybe you haven't implemented before. And they don't necessarily need to go all in at one time. You know, you can start with, you can still have your HL7, but you can also maybe enable some different API-based workflows. So any comments there, Dan?
I was thinking as you guys were talking about this, when I covered the semantic slide earlier, I think I just made it as simple as a code lookup and talked about it as enrichment, message enrichment, which in that case it really was. But I'm glad we have this slide because it reminds me that sometimes the semantic tool can do so much more. It's not just about being a simple code lookup as a replacement to our database. It can alert us on codes that are not even valid, right? It can put those in a special place to have manual working with the UI, you know. So I like that we introduced the clean and classify on this slide, because that's what I really didn't really mention with semantic before. So I'm glad those are here. It wasn't just data enrichment. There's a lot more to that. Looks like we have a couple questions here.
Yeah, so I can read the questions to you and for the audience. Are there performance overheads to consider with APIs and gateways? And certainly you talked about rate limiting earlier. And
all right, well, rate limiting would be something that either is imposed by an API that we are trying to call as a client, in which case if our volume is very high, we will need to appropriately react to that code. So what happens is when they enforce rate limiting, they give us back a special HTTPS response code saying too many requests. So you write your response handler to act accordingly. It doesn't mean we're done. It doesn't mean we have to shut down. It means we have to back off a little bit. We have to wait. So that could have an impact if you needed to back off and then your volume was such that you're getting queued up in your engine. Typically, we don't see that. To hit someone's, I haven't seen us hit the rate limit on anything except maybe in a test environment where they're wanting to limit it there. So I don't usually see the rate limiting aspect. Performance overheads. Anything else, Caitlin, on that question? Performance overheads with APIs and gateways.
I think you hit it. I mean, I think with our integration solutions, like typically we're seeing very high volumes, and typically the integration engines can handle volumes that are higher than a lot of the APIs. But like Dan said, we can enable different throttling or rate limiting as appropriate. As far as performance overhead, it's just interacting with any external system. If you're calling a database and the database can handle it, how long are we waiting for that response back? But as far as engine performance or performance with any of the APIs that are part of our interoperability suite, you should not that should not be a concern.
And something else to consider is, while if we're comparing number of messages per second over a TCP/IP connection that's open with the round trip of an API call, perhaps the round trip of the API call is more, but remember that the workflow is potentially different, right? We are accessing the data we need when we need it, rather than every single message whether we needed it or not, which was the traditional workflow. So we have some gains there, I think, just in terms of how we are using an API. I don't think we end up considering maybe a general responses. I don't think we ever end up considering an API as having overhead for us, probably because it's solving a problem that's making things much more efficient in the big picture. Another one here.
Yeah, it looks like we had another question like related to some Rhapsody configuration. Kind of looking like they're trying to use their EMR Spire APIs to access their own EHR data that may not be available in an ADT message, and that's actually a great use case for using APIs. Without knowing specifics for this particular EMR, I would say that a lot more EMRs are exposing their data via REST APIs. And so I think there's some questions about which communication point would be the best to use. And it's really going to depend on what the EHR is going to expose. I say probably typically are going to be via REST, but I definitely recommend follow up with your account manager, and we can see what EMR you're using and see where we can help, because this is a very common use case that a lot of our customers have implemented and have encountered.
Excellent.
Yeah, I like the use case called out in that question. I think it's actually better than the scheduling example that we had the slide for, where we have the need to complete some data, and we hope that there is an endpoint that our EHR can provide that we can just go grab it. So I really like that use case.
Well, excellent. I don't think we have any other questions in the chat, but certainly type them now, and we don't get them to them by the end, we will get back with you later. But closing items, thank you so much to our panelists, Caitlin and Dan, for sharing some of their expertise today. Thank you for those that responded to the poll and also sent questions in. Really appreciated your feedback and making this a lively discussion. But stay tuned for more on APIs. There's no way we could have covered everything about APIs in 45 minutes, and there's probably questions that you still have. So let's keep in touch and stay tuned for future webinars, for future content. But in the future, already we've got sites on talking about APIs used for data enrichment, some of the things we can make available, other things that are out there, the semantic APIs, an EMPI library full of APIs that are at your disposal if you're an EMPI customer. And just thanks for you being here today, and we'll talk soon.